Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that is literally going to shatter almost everything we thought we knew about the history of the Americas. If you grew up learning that the pre-Columbian Americas were just, these vast, empty wildernesses waiting to be discovered, well, buckle up. Prepare to have your mind completely blown by the sheer scale of the reality we've been missing. So, let's kick things off by challenging a pretty fundamental piece of our standard textbook education. How many people actually lived in the Americas before Columbus showed up in 1492? Most of us were taught to imagine a really sparse population, right? Maybe a few million people living simple, nomadic lives. But what if I told you that number was actually off by tens of millions?
And this right here perfectly captures the massive historical correction we're going through right now. We're totally moving away from that old myth of an empty, untouched continent. Because the reality is that the Americas were home to up to 100 million people. No way, right? We are talking about incredibly complex, densely populated civilizations that literally rivaled or even exceeded the populations of Europe at the exact same time.
Now, to wrap our heads around how this was even possible, we've got to completely rethink the timeline. For decades, the famous Clovis First theory was the gold standard, and it said people arrived about 13,000 years ago by walking across an ice-free land bridge. But new discoveries are just shattering that timeline. Finds at Monteverde in Chile push it back to 14,500 years. Then you've got fossilized footprints at White Sands in New Mexico pushing it all the way to 23,000 years ago, back when that land bridge was completely blocked by a mile of solid ice. And when you zoom out and consider that Aboriginal Australians were traveling by sea 65,000 years ago, the whole narrative totally changes.
Which brings us to a much more logical conclusion, the coastal migration hypothesis. So instead of just walking across a frozen land bridge, early Americans very likely used sophisticated maritime technology. Underwater archaeology and modern genetic evidence are both pointing to multiple waves of complex maritime migration. These were incredible, daring explorers navigating down the Pacific coast by boat, establishing themselves in all sorts of diverse environments tens of thousands of years earlier than we ever gave them credit for.
Section 1. Cities larger than Paris.
So, with populations established that long ago, what exactly did they build? Well, the answer is metropolitans that absolutely would have left European explorers completely speechless. Take the number 40,000. That is the potential peak population of a city called Cahokia around 1250 AD. It was located right in modern-day Illinois, just across the river from St. Louis. At its height, this indigenous metropolis was a massive, bustling, cultural and economic hub that dominated the entire region. And to really grasp the sheer scale of these ancient American achievements, try comparing Cahokia directly to medieval Paris in that exact same year, 1250 AD. Paris back then was this organic, kind of chaotic tangle of winding muddy alleys. Cahokia, on the other hand, featured master-planned grid streets, highly sophisticated courtyard complexes, and Monk's Mound, which is this jaw-dropping 14-acre earthen pyramid with a base literally larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It likely had a larger population than London did at the time, too.
But the engineering definitely didn't stop at city grids. 500. That is the number of miles of sophisticated irrigation canals engineered by the Hohokam people out in the incredibly harsh desert of modern-day Arizona. They understood water velocity and sustainable flow rate so incredibly well that, get this, modern engineers in Phoenix actually reused some of their exact ancient canal routes.
You know, even our whole concept of untouched nature is pretty off base. Take the Amazon rainforest. We think of it as this pristine wilderness, right? Actually, it's heavily engineered. Indigenous ecologists spent over 2,500 years actively cultivating terra preta. That's a manufactured, super nutrient-rich black earth. They intentionally planted and managed useful fruit and nut trees across an area roughly the size of France. It wasn't just a wild forest. It was a carefully, deliberately managed food orchard.
Section 2. The biological apocalypse. Now you might be wondering, if all this massive infrastructure and huge populations existed, why did European settlers think they were discovering an empty wilderness? Well, the incredibly dark, tragic reality is that diseases like smallpox, measles, and typhus, which were carried by the very earliest explorers, triggered an absolute biological apocalypse. Because indigenous populations had been isolated for something like 15,000 years, they had absolutely zero natural immunity. We are looking at a devastating 90 to 95% catastrophic mortality rate.
This wave of devastation swept across the continent, wiping out entire, complex civilizations long before major European colonial expansion even really got underway.
There is a hauntingly powerful thought that perfectly captures this reality. They were looking at a graveyard. They just didn't know it yet. When those later colonists finally arrived and saw these overgrown forests and abandoned earthworks, they weren't looking at a natural, untouched state of nature, not at all. They were looking at the post-apocalyptic ruins of a completely depopulated world.
Section 3. Inspiring the U.S. Constitution.
Yet, despite this truly unimaginable catastrophe, incredible indigenous political structures survived, and they contained a brilliance that was quietly appropriated by the very people colonizing the land. Take the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, for example. For centuries, they operated under what's known as the Great Law of Peace. Now, think about this. While 15th century Europe was still being ruled by absolute monarchs and claims of divine right, the Haudenosaunee were already using consensus, they had a built-in separation of powers, and they relied on clan mothers who actually held the power to nominate and veto leaders. Benjamin Franklin directly observed and borrowed heavily from this functioning democratic system when he was drafting the Albany Planted Union, which, as we know, later heavily inspired the U.S. Constitution.
And that sophistication extended well into the sciences, too. Indigenous societies seamlessly integrated advanced astronomy with their agriculture and politics. They discovered that willow bark contained salicin, which is literally the chemical precursor to modern aspirin. The Maya were using base 20 mathematics and had grasped the concept of zero way before Europe did. They practiced incredibly advanced ecological management, like using controlled burns and agroforestry, and they utilized decentralized, highly mobile military strategies that completely baffled European generals. They were, without a doubt, brilliant scientists of their place and time.
Section 4. The machinery of erasure.
As you can imagine, all of this political and scientific genius was deeply inconvenient for the narrative of colonization. Because, let's be real, recognizing indigenous people as highly civilized and advanced would make taking their land morally impossible. And that led to deliberate, systemic attempts to just rewrite history. Richard Henry Pratt, who founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, stated this mission incredibly explicitly. He said, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." As physical erasure was sort of winding down, cultural erasure was just getting ramped up right inside the classrooms.
This machinery of erasure systematically attempted to destroy living cultures. They forcefully removed young children from their families. They outlawed native languages, which completely cut off entire generations from their ecological and legal knowledge. And over time, these complex, deeply vibrant histories were replaced in the public consciousness by cheap Hollywood composites, the noble savage or the bloodthirsty warrior tropes, reducing hundreds of diverse, brilliant, and distinct nations into mere mascots.
Section 5. Native America is still here. But here is absolutely the most important takeaway from this whole explainer. That machinery of erasure completely failed. The story does not end in a tragedy or in some dusty museum exhibit. Still, we have to confront what historians call the past tense problem. It's the super harmful grammatical habit of talking about Native Americans exclusively with words like were or used to, as if they are some vanished historical group. Talking about them in the past tense is a literal form of ongoing erasure. We have to firmly correct this by centering the vibrant present. Native people didn't leave the stage. Just consider the modern indigenous reality today. Did you know there are 574 federally recognized sovereign nations in the U.S. alone? They actively operate their own legal jurisdictions. There is this massive, incredible cultural renaissance happening right now, too. Languages are being revitalized through TikTok, language apps, and amazing immersion schools. The land back movement is resulting in the actual co-management of national parks. And native scientists, lawyers, artists, and astronauts are out there, actively shaping our shared future.
So I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought. If our textbooks were this completely wrong about the past, what else are we missing right now in the present? The story of America is so much older, it's vastly more complex, and it's infinitely more fascinating than we were ever taught in school. I highly encourage you to go seek out modern indigenous voices, historians, and artists to continue exploring this reality for yourself. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the narrative.